Macroeconomic Theory, A Dynamic General Equilibrium Approach, by Michael Wickens. Preface. No subject with a foot in both the academic and public domains, like macroeconomics, remains unchanged for long. The search for improved explanations, and the challenge of new problems and new circumstances, keep such subjects in a constant state of flux. The first edition of Macroeconomic Theory opened with these observations. It was only a matter of weeks after publication that events bore out these remarks. The financial crisis that engulfed developed economies in 2008, undermining their banking systems and their monetary and fiscal policies, and causing bankruptcy and recession, has caused yet another reappraisal of macroeconomic theory. Dynamic stochastic general equilibrium. Macroeconomic theory and finance were very much in the firing line, being widely perceived as the main culprits. As I have argued elsewhere, the critics have missed the point of the dynamic stochastic general equilibrium approach to macroeconomics, and their apparent preference for a return to previous ways of analyzing the macroeconomy would be a highly retrograde step. Dynamic stochastic general equilibrium. Macroeconomics has emerged in recent years as the latest step in the development of macroeconomics from its origins in the work of Keynes in the 1930s. It is largely an attempt to integrate macroeconomics with microeconomics, by providing microfoundations for macroeconomics. Most modern research in macroeconomics now adopts this approach. The purpose of this book is to provide an account of the dynamic stochastic general equilibrium approach to modern macroeconomic theory and, in the process, make DSGE macroeconomics accessible to both the new generation of students and older generations brought up on earlier approaches to macroeconomics, particularly those charged with giving policy advice to government, central banks, or business. A feature of the dynamic stochastic general equilibrium approach to macroeconomics is that it considers the whole economy at all times. Consequently, instead of viewing the economy as a collection of features to be studied separately at first, before perhaps being assembled into a complete picture, the focus of dynamic stochastic general equilibrium macroeconomics is the economy as a whole. This is especially helpful when formulating economic policy, where one wants to know the wider effects of any given measure. It is essential knowledge for a policy advisor. Dynamic stochastic general equilibrium macroeconomics evolved from neoclassical macroeconomics and real business cycle theory to include virtually every aspect of the aggregate economy, including the open economy, exchange rates, and monetary and fiscal policy. It incorporates both Keynesian and New Keynesian economics, with the latter's emphasis on the microfoundations of macroeconomics and the role of monopolistic competition, key elements in modern theories of inflation targeting. Once the preserve of finance, through DSGE macroeconomics, asset pricing is now reclaimed as part of macroeconomics. A particular feature of this book is the inclusion of asset pricing theory as part of macroeconomics. It is shown that exactly the same model used to determine macroeconomic aggregates, like consumption and capital accumulation, also provides an explanation of stock and bond prices, and foreign exchange, based on economic fundamentals. This enables the sources of risk to be identified, as well as priced. The aim of this book is to develop, step by step, a coherent, rather than an exhaustive, account of the macroeconomy. The reader is encouraged to consult the many specialist texts for further detail and a wider coverage. It was therefore necessary to be selective about what to include in the first edition and what, if anything, to add in the second edition. The principal changes are two new chapters, one on banks, financial intermediation, and unconventional monetary policy, Chapter 15, and another on unemployment, Chapter 10. Readers of the first edition particularly liked the incorporation of finance with macroeconomics. In banks, financial intermediation, and unconventional monetary policy, I have attempted to develop further the interconnections between macroeconomics and finance. This chapter is also an attempt to address a weakness of conventional DSGE models identified by the financial crisis, namely, the absence of a banking sector in these models. Many working papers have recently attempted to fill this gap. Most focus on the role of financial intermediation in the liquidity shortages of banks that emerged as a result of the financial crisis. Arguably, however, this was primarily a consequence of the financial crisis and not its cause, which, in my view, was associated more with a failure to assess and price the risk of default. In Chapter 15, after an assessment of the causes and implications of the financial crisis for the macroeconomy and macroeconomic theory and a discussion of financial frictions and intermediation, which draws on the chapters on finance, chapters 11 and 12, I have proposed a microfinance model of default risk. The chapter on unemployment is designed partly to show the relevance of both search theory, the topic for which the 2010 Nobel Prize in Economic Sciences was awarded, and efficiency wages to macroeconomics. I argue that although these well-known theories are able to account for unemployment in steady-state equilibrium, they do not provide a plausible explanation of the much higher levels of unemployment in recession. An alternative explanation is suggested that draws on the theories of wage and price stickiness, which are advanced in Chapter 9. In this chapter, in addition to these two chapters, new material has been added in almost every other chapter. The most substantial changes are to two renumbered chapters, Chapter 12, where I have discussed the crucial role of the term structure in the transmission of monetary policy, and Chapter 14, which incorporates recent work on price and wage stickiness in DSGE models. I have used the name Dynamic General Equilibrium, DG, Macroeconomics in the subtitle to this book as a generic term that includes Dynamic Stochastic General Equilibrium Macroeconomics. In order to simplify the exposition, I have suppressed the stochastic element of the macroeconomy where convenient, because a key feature of modern macroeconomic theory is the role played by unexpected shocks in causing business cycles, and finance theory is largely about how to price assets when the future is uncertain. The eventual aim must be to develop theories that incorporate shocks, that is, DSGE models. The virtue of dynamic stochastic general equilibrium macroeconomics is brought out by the following encounter with a frustrated student. He protested that he knew there were many theories of macroeconomics, so why was I teaching him only one? My reply was that this was because only one theory was required to analyze the economy, and it seemed easier to remember one all-embracing theory than a large number of different theories. I give the credit for my own conversion to dynamic stochastic general equilibrium macroeconomics to the first edition of Robert Barrow's undergraduate textbook Macroeconomics, Barrow 1997. This was the first textbook to present macroeconomics using a general equilibrium approach. Many years ago, in 1987, when visiting the University of Florida, I was asked to teach a section of macroeconomics too. As my research area at the time was primarily econometrics, I had not taught macroeconomics before. Since I had strongly disliked the Keynesian approach to macroeconomics, even during my undergraduate days at the London School of Economics, partly as a learning device I chose macroeconomics as a course book. Although the students found macroeconomics far too hard, I found it, together with Kydland and Prescott's real business cycle analysis, to be a most revealing way to think about both macroeconomics and econometrics. It made me realize that the traditional way of doing macroeconometrics, equation by equation, had largely failed to engage the interest of macroeconomic theorists because the emphasis was too much on the dynamic specification of the model and too little on the key macroeconomic parameters or the general equilibrium implications of the estimated model. Since any variable can be closely approximated by a univariate time series representation, The danger in traditional macroeconometrics is that, in trying to improve goodness of fit by using a general dynamic specification, the omission of, possibly important, variables may be obscured. This indicated to me that macroeconomic theory should be given a much more important role in macroeconometric model building, and the reliance on time series methods should be rethought. This is still not a popular view in the United Kingdom, and was heretical for a former postgraduate student of the LSE, particularly one brought up in the LSE tradition of econometrics. Although Barrow's macroeconomics uses little mathematics, in this book the aim is to provide a more formal demonstration of the results. In my view, it is only by going into such details that one can obtain a proper understanding of the strengths and weaknesses of the theory. This was beautifully shown in the classic Blanchard and Fisher book Lectures in Macroeconomics, which gave the first technical textbook treatment of dynamic stochastic general equilibrium macroeconomics. The present book may even be regarded simply as a more mathematical exposition of macroeconomics with extensions to more recent research and is an updated version of Lectures in Macroeconomics. In order to maintain the flow of the argument in the book, I have tried to avoid unnecessary clutter by keeping footnotes and references to a minimum. I should therefore like to acknowledge my enormous debt to the writings of others whose work I have drawn on without giving them explicit recognition. Some of the material in the book is original, usually with the purpose of filling in gaps in the literature in order to make the coverage of topics more comprehensive. The immediate motivation for this book will be familiar to many teachers who have tried to innovate by including recent research ideas in their lectures. Having decided to change radically the content of macroeconomics in the Master of Science degree at the University of York, I found that there was no single book that I could recommend to the students that covered all of the material I wished to include. The students soon complained that there was no book for the course and asked me to photocopy and distribute my lecture notes, which I did. The next cohort of students complained that they couldn't read my handwritten lecture notes. So why didn't I type them out, which I did. Subsequent cohorts complained that notes were all very well but they would be even more useful if they were written up properly with all of the arguments included. So I did. I then received requests from old students, who had heard about this latest development, to send them the notes too. At this point I decided that I might as well turn my notes into a book, and so redeem a pledge made long ago to Richard Bagalley, then with Princeton University Press, to write a book for him. I then provided my students with chapters of the book instead of lecture notes. Their complaint now is that the course seems to contain rather a lot of material and some of it is rather technical. Much of the new material is also technical, reflecting its treatment in the literature. Thanks for bringing about this book therefore go especially to my students, who have been right at every stage and have prompted me to do better by them. Even so, without Richard Bagalley's constant support and encouragement, I doubt if I would have made the required effort. I would also like to thank many colleagues for their comments on either the first or the second edition of this book, especially Harris Dellas, Patrick Minford, Paul Misen, Gulson Oskin, Vito Polito, Neil Rankin, and Peter Smith. I am also very grateful to the many people who have written to me about the first edition, some pointing out changes and corrections that should be made, and to Sam Clark of T&T Productions Limited for his production expertise and for our many fascinating discussions about written English. I am particularly grateful to my wife Ruth for not grudging the many months, now years, spent writing this book, which she regards as an endless process, like painting the fourth bridge, and like the development of macroeconomics. In all honesty, I cannot call it work, as it has proved such a stimulating project. I hope that the reader will share my enthusiasm, and the enlightenment that this way of doing macroeconomics brings.